Good morning. Again, my name is Taylor Abshier. I'm a private lands biologist with Ducks Unlimited, and I would like to thank Texan by Nature for recognizing the Texas Prairie Wetland Project as a conservation wrangler this year. So to start off, I'm going to take us through the history, the accomplishments, and the need for the Texas Prairie Wetland Project. And so Texas' importance to waterfowl. Texas provides critical staging, wintering, habitat for 90% of waterfowl populations within the state, within the Central Flyway, as well as about 250,000 snow geese. This includes our northern pintail, blue and green-winged teal, gadwall, northern shovelers, etc. Permanent and semi-permanent wetlands provide critical nesting and brooding habitat for our resident mottle ducks, as well as our fulvous and black-bellied whistling ducks. And so the need for a private lands program. In Texas, it is 97%, 95% privately owned, and over 7 million acres of wetland habitat has been lost. And over 50% of that habitat has been lost in the last 200 years. So to offset this loss of wetland, partnering with these private landowners and individuals is essential to keeping these habitats on the landscape. So in 1991, a partnership like no other began. It was comprised of state, federal, nonprofit, and private landowning individuals to all come together with one main mission to put these wetlands on the landscape, keeping waterfowl on the Texas Gulf Coast. These partners include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ducks Unlimited, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, as well as the Dr. Edward and Sally Futch Charitable Foundation. So the Texas Prairie Wetland Project began, and it was born on science and founded by science, and it had two main objectives in its early stages, and that was to deliver wetland habitat to meet waterfowl foraging objectives set by the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and also to provide critical staging, wintering, and breeding habitat for waterfowl within the Texas Gulf Coast. And so how do we conserve? We cover 3 priority areas of the Texas Gulf Coast that have been identified by the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, stretching from the Laguna Madre, the Texas Mid-Coast, and the Texas portion of the Chenier Plain. This represents 28 counties, and through this area, we are creating, restoring, and enhancing these wetlands on the landscape. And we are doing that at a cost of about $300 an acre, where we are providing a cost share through the Texas Prairie Wetland Project to the landowners as an incentive payment to get these projects on the landscape. And so an overview of a project, I kind of want to walk you through what a typical prairie wetland project looks like. The landowner site visit, we go out and kick the dirt with the landowner, ride around meeting and visiting with them about their goals for the property, what are the land uses, because here in Texas we've become very efficient in taking 1 acre of 1 acre of landscape and using it for 4 or 5 different practices, whether that's farming, ranching, oil and gas industry, hunting operations, as well as the landowners' interests themselves. And so making sure that all of these objectives come together and visiting with these landowners and stewarding those relationships, we then turn that into a survey and design where our DU and our partners will survey out a project. We will provide a design to these landowners, which then turns into an agreement that these sites will be managed and maintained. We assist in construction management as well as final checkout of these projects. I want to dive a little bit deeper into what a wetland development agreement is, or a WDA. And these agreements are for 10 to 15 years on the landscape that landowner will manage and maintain those sites. It goes into details about our cost share and how we will reimburse that landowner for the work that is completed. And again, that is for up to $300 an acre to implement these practices on the landscape. It includes a detailed management plan that these sites will be managed, including disking, roller chopping, herbicide treatment, as well as the opportune times that these sites need to be flooded and the duration that that water needs to be on the landscape to be the most beneficial to waterfowl. Annually, the Texas Prairie Wetland Project delivers 15 to 30 individual wetland development agreements, and that relates to about 3,000 acres a year in habitat delivery. So for construction, Ducks Unlimited and the NRCS will provide a survey and design to these landowners. As you see in the bottom right-hand side of this slide, that is a detailed plan. And through this program, we are cost sharing on levees and water control structures to impound this water on the landscape. And you can see a water control structure being installed in the top portion of this slide as well. And so with that, we are putting large-scale water on the landscape. Before a project goes into construction, we have a pre-construction meeting answering any questions that the landowner or contractor may have to verify that the project is going to be constructed correctly. And in that process, we will go out and do monitoring of that site as construction continues to make sure that the elevations are correct of the levees, and we are going to hold the appropriate amount of water. And within these units, we are holding between 12 and 24 inches of water for waterfowl. And so DU will also provide project oversight and final checkout to verify construction has been completed. So I want to go into some of the benefits of having wetlands on the landscape. It's not just about waterfowl, it's about the people that benefit, it's about the wildlife and the environment. And so diving into the people aspect, wetlands can provide up to 3 acre-feet of water storage per acre. And when you look at recent flooding that has occurred in Houston area and Beaumont, having wetlands on the landscape can store up to 3 acre-feet, preventing that water from going downstream quickly and causing flooding in urban areas. These wetlands also provide hunting opportunities. In 2006, there were over 121,000 waterfowl hunters in the state of Texas. And these hunters, they're buying duck stamps, they're buying hunting license, which all goes back into conservation and leads into jobs. And these are Texas jobs. And so hunting and fishing in the state of Texas supports almost 66,000 jobs within our state. That's state positions, federal positions, conservation positions out on the landscape, working with private landowners and implementing additional habitat on the landscape. So wildlife benefits. I want to go into a little bit more science in this slide. So for waterfowl, the Texas Prairie Wetland Project provides an additional 5.3 million duck energy days per year. Now, a duck energy day is how much energy one duck will require to live one day on the landscape, and that's based on how many kilocalories that are needed to survive. There's been a lot of research done through graduate students in the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and they have compiled this data, reviewing multiple wetland sites on the landscape, stretching across the entire Gulf Coast region over into Mississippi and into Louisiana, evaluating wetlands and the food availability that these birds can take a hold of. And so that has been broken down and averaged out across specific wetland types. And we work in 3 different wetlands, 3 different types of wetlands. We have agricultural wetlands that we are working in that are directly tied to rice production, moist soil wetlands, and freshwater emergent wetlands. And so for the purpose of this slide, I've compiled those 3 numbers and averaged that out to about 1,700 duck energy days per acre. And so one more way to kind of read that is you could support 1,700 ducks on 1 acre of wetland for 1 day, or you could support 1 duck for 1,700 days on a single acre. So there's a lot of food in these wetlands, and through this program we're providing a pretty substantial additive amount of food on the landscape. And that also relates to shorebirds. Shorebirds are of high concern and interest to a lot of people. And so through this program, we provide an additional 168,000 shorebird energy days per year. And so that science and those numbers have all been modeled again through the joint venture as well as through graduate students doing research in these sites. And over 40 species of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds are dependent on these wetlands. And of these 40 species, they are species of greatest concern within the state of Texas. And so implementing these wetlands, it goes beyond just waterfowl. You're benefiting multiple species on the landscape. And so the environment, almost 50% of our global fresh water is stored in freshwater wetlands. So you're looking at that water storage and having that available on the landscape. Nutrient sequestration is a huge benefit of having wetlands. These wetlands are pulling our nitrogen and phosphorus out of these water systems, out of these river systems, preventing that from going into our bays and estuaries, and causing fish kills and algae blooms down in our bay systems in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as reducing the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico. So there are a ton of environmental benefits through wetlands and having them on the landscape. And so going back to the next 2 points that I have here, those are tying back to accomplishments through this program. 46% of the acres that have been completed through the Texas Prairie Wetland Project have been in conjunction with active rice producing landowners and farmers in the state of Texas. That represents 22% of the actively farmed rice in this state. So we've worked on almost 25% of the available, or of the rice grounds within the state of Texas, which is a lot of ground. The remaining 54% of the acres that we have completed have been freshwater emergent wetlands as well as moist soil wetlands. And these have been completed in ranches, creek beds, coastal marshes, and our floodplains. So looking back at the 28 years of conservation, we have completed over 85,000 acres worth of wetland habitat and added an additional 40,000 acre feet of water storage to the landscape. With that, we have invested through this program and our partners, as well as private landowners, over $28.1 million worth of conservation work into the Texas Gulf Coast. And one more thing, the Texas Prairie Wetland Project within the Texas mid-coast, so stretching from Corpus to Galveston, of the available freshwater inland habitat, the Texas Prairie Wetland Project represents up to 25% of that habitat that can benefit and be used by waterfowl. So that is a substantial footprint for this program, and moving forward, we look to increase that number. So one more slide that kind of goes back into the details of the accomplishments. Again, that's 85,000 acres worth of wetland habitat that has been completed. That is working with 703 individual wetland development agreements. So these are individual landowners within the Gulf Coast region. We have implemented over 1,500 individually managed wetland units on the landscape. And so each of these sites can be managed independently and will benefit waterfowl, as well as the other species. This table or graph here at the bottom represents the acres that have been delivered over the past 28 years. There is quite a bit of fluctuation, but on average, we are delivering about 3,000 acres a year. So this is a really cool slide, and it goes to show the investment of the partners as well as the individual landowners and how much they have invested into this program. So of the $28 million that has gone into this conservation work, the program has invested $14.7 million. And those funds come from the North American Wetland Conservation Act, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Dr. Edward and Sally Futch Foundation, as well as several other organizations compiling that funding into that 14.7. Now, landowners out of their own hard cash have invested $13.4 million into this habitat work. So the landowners are seeing the benefits and the need to have this on the landscape, and they're willing to put their own money into this project. And so we are delivering habitat at scale across 28 counties for about $329 an acre, which, if you look at wetland costs and delivering those habitats across the landscape, that number can range from $300 an acre upwards of $1,000 an acre. And so we're very much on the bottom end of that cost in delivering these on the landscape. So for evaluation, the Texas Prairie Wetland Project goes through a great deal of evaluation because we want to make sure that we are delivering the highest quality habitat, working with the best landowners, and and verifying that the work that we have done is being beneficial and being used on the landscape. And so through that, we go through an annual surface water monitoring protocol. And that is collecting 3 images from Landsat satellites that we collect during the early, middle, and late period while the waterfowl are here. So stretching from August 31st all the way over to March 31st. And so during this time frame, we're evaluating this program. And so these images are then ran through an imaging software identifying water on the landscape, and the Gulf Coast Joint Venture provides us with this information. And there's 3 metrics that they are looking at. The first one being landscape condition relative to the habitat objectives that they have set. And so where are we on that scale of all the available water on the landscape? The second one is flooding performance of the Texas Prairie Wetland Management Units. So this is looking at each individual unit and is that unit flooded or not. And the last one is the contribution of Texas Prairie Wetland Project sites toward landscape level habitat availability. And so that is combining the first 2 bullets and seeing the scale and reach that the Texas Prairie Wetland Project has had on the landscape. And that's where that 25% number came from, is from this research and evaluation that we complete every year. And so with that, we do go through a great deal of evaluation. So kind of tying this back to This Land is Our Land, through this flagship program and the partnerships created, we have taken ownership in the conservation of wetlands and waterfowl habitat. Landowners are committing millions of dollars to ensure that waterfowl remain on the Texas Gulf Coast. And the Texas Prairie Wetland Project is providing opportunity for future generations to enjoy the landscape and resources conserved today. So lastly, looking into the needs and what are we trying to get out of this program into the future. We are constantly looking for new avenues to reach new landowners and opportunities to put additional habitat on the landscape and building new relationships with new partners. We are looking for corporate participation from coastal landowning businesses, and this could be in conjunction with wetland management or creating new wetlands in and around facilities. We are also looking for increased public awareness, just bringing information about this program to the public. And thanks to Texan by Nature and the recognition that comes with the Conservation Wrangler, we have done that and being here to present to y'all today. And lastly, additional funding is always key to keeping these programs going and keeping this habitat available on the landscape. And every dollar that comes into the program is matched 2 or 3 times between federal grants, and as it's brought in, we take that money and multiply it across the landscape. And so with that, I would like to say thank you again to Texan by Nature for recognizing the Texas Prairie Wetland Project as a conservation wrangler, as well as our partners, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Ducks Unlimited, and the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, as well as the Dr. Edward and Sally Futch Foundation. Thank you.